Good morning, everyone. My name is Simone Rurik, and this morning we'll be doing a new skill. This skill is ambulation, and as we know, ambulation means to walk. So we'll be doing this skill, and I'll be explaining as I go along. Now, we have learned that there are 5 major things that they look for in the skill, in all the skills that we do, which is infection control, privacy, safety, direct and indirect contact. Keep in mind, guys, that those are not the only 5 things that they're looking for in the skills, but they are the main 5 that that they look for, that they judge you by, the main ones, the major ones. So guys, as I go along, I'll be explaining, and of course I hope that this video is informative and also it encourages you to learn more and it's easily understood, so that's one more step to gaining your certification in your exams. So let's begin. Good morning, Mrs. Jones. My name is Simone Rurik, and this morning I'll be your nursing assistant. I'll be assisting you with ambulation. Is that okay with you, Mrs. Jones? Okay, Mrs. Jones, I'll go wash my hands and be right back. Notice that I introduced myself. I told her who I am, what position I hold, and of course I told her what I was going to do. I even asked her if it is okay with her. She has a right to deny my service or to give me permission to carry out my service. So that is why I asked her if it is okay. She said yes. Before I go wash my hands, I'll be giving her privacy by pulling the curtain. After washing my hands, I get back to Mrs. Jones. I'm going to make sure that the service that I'm giving is to Mrs. Jones and that she's the correct person that is sitting in the chair. So I'll be asking her name. And also I'm going to be asking her date of birth just to make sure that she's alert and not confused. If she is confused, you must report it to the nurse. Okay? So I'll continue. Mrs. Jones, may I see your ID bracelet, please? What is your name? What is your date of birth? Thank you, Mrs. Jones. I'll go gather my supplies and we can begin. Now, the supplies that I will need will be my gait belt. And this is called a gait belt. Now, when we're opening our gait belt, the gait belt should never touch the ground. So because I know this gait belt is a little bit long, I'll be opening it in this direction, right? So I don't want it to touch the ground. But before, I will take my gait belt and I get back to Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, I see you have your non-skid shoes on. Wonderful, Mrs. Jones. Notice that the patient needs a non-skid shoes so that when we're walking, she would not slip or slide and fall. So we need a shoes with some grip so that, when she's walking, she's okay. So the next thing I'll be doing is to open my gait belt. When I open my gait belt, I make sure it's not touching the ground. So I'm going to this is how I'm going to work my gait belt. I open it and I'm going to be putting the gait belt around Mrs. Jones' waist. So I'm going to make sure the gait belt is on my arm like this. May I have your assistant, please? So I have a little friend here and I would like to demonstrate to you guys what is going to happen. I roll my gait belt like this. Let me get out of the way. Like this. Because I'm going to be putting it around Mrs. Jones' waist. Mrs. Jones is sitting there, but I'm going to demonstrate on my friend here. So I have the gait belt in my hand like this. Now when I'm putting the gait belt on, before I go any further, Mrs. Jones' right side is, she has a what? Her right side is, that's where she needs the help. So in ambulation, one side of the person is what? Is weak. One side is weak, and so we're going to need to help her. That's why we're helping her to walk with the gait belt, okay? So one side of the person is weak. So now, this is the gait belt. When we're putting on the gait belt, turn this way. Turn to the camera. We never, no, so the right hand is weak, right? So don't move the arm. So I'm going to put my hand through here. See my hand through her arm? See, this is the belt. We never run the belt on the person's skin, clothes. We never do that, never. So when I'm putting on the belt, this is what happens. I have the belt in my hand folded like this. Because when I move it, I want to move it in tiers, like 1, 2, around the person. So look at me putting on the belt. So I put my hands through here. This is 1, I let it go. 2, bringing it around. Notice it's not on the skin. And then I measure and I open, and this is where it's at now. Okay, guys? But we never pull it on the skin or on the clothes, all right? Yeah. So that is what is going to be happening when I'm putting on the belt on Mrs. Jones. Okay, you can see. Thank you. So let's continue. So when I'm going to put on the belt, this is what I'll be saying to Mrs. Jones. First, I place my right foot between Mrs. Jones' feet. I ask Mrs. Jones, could you lean forward for me, please? She leans forward, and I'm going to stoop and put the belt around Mrs. Jones' waist. Very good, Mrs. Jones. And there is the belt. Okay, guys? Okay. Now I'm going to buckle the belt on Mrs. Jones. Make sure it is as tight as possible, but not hurting Mrs. Jones. So to make sure, I'm going to put 2 fingers inside here and ask Mrs. Jones, is this okay, Mrs. Jones? She says yes. So I'm going to continue to close the belt. So that's the belt around Mrs. Jones. Now, I'm going to put Mrs. Jones to stand. Now, after putting Mrs. Jones to stand, you are going to ask her if she is feeling any dizziness. So when putting Mrs. Jones to stand, I'm going to stoop eye level with Mrs. Jones, put her to stand, and ask, Mrs. Jones, are you feeling any dizziness? So I'm going to place my hands to the side here, stoop with my back straight. Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, will be standing. 1, 2, 3, and Mrs. Jones is up. Okay? Notice that I'm holding Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, are you feeling any dizziness? Because you have to hold firmly. You don't want Mrs. Jones to fall, right? Yeah. So now I'll be going to the weak side. We stand on the weak side. That's where it needs the help. So I'm going to be standing on the weak side. But I have to move. I cannot let go of Mrs. Jones. So I'm going to be moving my hands, while holding the gait belt until I'm in the position. Okay? Now, after this, notice that I'm standing to the side of Mrs. Jones. I cannot walk the side of Mrs. Jones, and I also cannot hold imprison Mrs. Jones' arm. So what I'll do is to continue holding Mrs. Jones in the back and move my hand to the side. And this arm should be free. So I have one arm under here and one in the back of Mrs. Jones holding the gait belt, okay? Now, how I try to measure my my stance with Mrs. Jones is that I always make sure the shoulder is between my chest here, my breast right here. So this is how we're standing. Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, will begin walking. 1, 2, 3. So both our legs are moving at the same pace. And I am actually not walking side by side. I'm not directly behind her, but I'm to the side behind her with her shoulder in the middle. So half of me is there and half is outside. Okay? Mrs. Jones, let's turn. Let's continue. And we're walking. Okay, Mrs. Jones, let's continue. So now, Mrs. Jones is tired and I'm going to be taking her back. So I'm going to tell Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, we'll be turning back. 1, 2, 3. So I turn Mrs. Jones, and while I'm turning Mrs. Jones, I'm behind her. All right? So I'm like this. See? And I'm still standing in the stance where I began, right? With my chest here, and I'm holding her in the back. Mrs. Jones, let's continue. Notice that we're walking on our legs or anything, and we're not bumping into each other. Okay? So Mrs. Jones is here, and I notice that Mrs. Jones is near to the chair, and I'm going to be turning Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, let's turn. Do we turn like this? And we turn Mrs. Jones, and I'm right here. I'm in the same position that I began, right? Yeah. So I'm going to ask Mrs. Jones. Mrs. Jones, is the back of your feet touching the chair? No. She says no. All right? So let's go here. Let's go back here. I was right here. So I'm going to measure it up to make sure her feet is touching the back of the chair. Mrs. Jones, let's continue. A little bit closer. Let's turn Mrs. Jones. Let's turn. Mrs. Jones, is the back of your feet touching the chair? That's what needs to be happen. So on the very first time, you must make sure that she comes as close to as possible. So when you turn her, the back of her foot is touching the chair. Okay, guys? Mm-hmm. So her feet is touching the chair. Now, I'm going to be holding her still. I'm not letting go because I need to get in front of Mrs. Jones. So I still hold on. Put my hands holding because I don't want Mrs. Jones to fall until I get to the front of get in front of Mrs. Jones. No, I want to put Mrs. Jones to sit. When I'm putting her to sit, it's the same motion where I place a foot in between Mrs. Jones' feet, and I'm going to tell her on the count of 3 we'll be sitting. Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3 we'll be sitting down. Guys, she must be sitting straight with her back to the chair back. She must be sitting back in the chair, okay? So when you're putting her down, you should not be hearing, you know, that hard sit. You should be taking her down very gently, okay? And of course, we're going to do it with our back straight with good body mechanics, okay? Mm-hmm. So Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, we'll be sitting. 1, 2, 3. Very good. Now, if Mrs. Jones' back was not touching the chair, what we would do would just go around to Mrs. Jones' back like this and say, Mrs. Jones, on the count of 3, we'll be pulling you back. 1, 2, 3. Right? Only if her back was not touching the chair. All right? In the very first time you put her down, you must aim to put her down with her back touching the chair. The only time you do go behind the person is when the person sat down and the back was not touching the chair. That's the only time you go behind and pull the person. So now that Mrs. Jones is sitting back in her chair, the next thing I'll be doing is removing her gait belt, okay? Mm-hmm. Now, when I'm removing the gait belt, it's the same procedure. You don't want the belt to be running on the person's clothes or skin, all right? So this is how it happens. Mrs. Jones, I'll be taking your gait belt off. I place the foot between her feet. I pull the gait belt. Then I say, Mrs. Jones, could you lean forward to me, please? Stoop. And from one hand to the next, I put the gait belt in my hand. Very good, Mrs. Jones. Thank you. So now I'm going to put away the gait belt, okay? So I'm finished with the gait belt. Now that I'm finished with the gait belt, Mrs. Jones is back in her seat. The next thing I'll make sure is that Mrs. Jones has her call bell to call me if she needs anything. So guys, my call bell is not here, but we always make sure that to find our call bells, we always place the call bell under the pillow so we know where they are. But the call bell is not there, so I'll be improvising by using this phone. This is the call bell, okay? So I'll say, Mrs. Jones, here is your call bell. Feel free to call me if you need anything. Then I'll open the curtain. I'll go wash my hands. I come back, I look around. If there's anything on the floor, if everything is okay, then I say my skill is finished. Guys, I hope this skill was informative. I hope that you like them. And of course, I'm going to ask you again, like, subscribe, feel free to leave a comment. And of course, guys, I hope the skill is helpful and it's a step closer to your exam. And guys, this is another skill that was made. Whoop whoop, I did it again.